right. Well, here we are once again at the very lovely and actually gray and snowy corner of Glenwood and Lunt. We're in the heart of Rogers Park. You're listening to another edition of Live from the Heartland Radio, and this is Michael James, your host for this morning's edition. I have a number of guests coming on this morning. We're going to start off with Dan Dale. He is the pastor at the Wellington Avenue United Church of Christ. And then we're going to have a couple of young fellows, including Cadien James from a band called Friends, and they're going to be performing on the 30th of December over at the No Exit Cafe. Friend, not Friends. And we're going to have Thom Clark doing a little political analysis on some of the upcoming races that we have. So let's get started with Dan Dale. Good morning to you, Dan.
Good morning, Michael. Good to be here.
Last time I saw you, you were here having breakfast, some kind of serious meeting, and I attacked you and said, how about coming on the radio show? And I'm glad you made it up here.
Good to be here this morning.
You recently were in Honduras, and Honduras is a place that I think there's a lot of turmoil. It always was kind of a lackey state for the United States. Lo and behold, there became a resistance movement, peasants' movements, a lot of pursuit of democracy. The President Zayala, who actually tried to make it a little bit better for people there, was kind of thrown out in a coup.
That's correct, yes.
The U.S. came forth and denounced the coup, but then they did it in a total about-face and have supported the new election. Why don't you fill us in on a little background about what's going on in Honduras?
Okay, well, first, Michael, a little about myself. I lived and worked in El Salvador in the 80s and have been very active in Central America solidarity work for, going on 30 years now, and have been going down to Latin America every year during that time. So this situation in Honduras, as the chair of the board of the Chicago Religious Leadership Network on Latin America, we participated in a delegation with Teachers for Social Justice and Voz de los de Abajo to create a delegation to go down and observe the situation, particularly human rights violations, under the coup regime. So a little background that, as you said, the development of the social movements in Honduras. Honduras has been one of the countries in Latin America, in Central America, that has often been seen as atrasado, or behind the other countries, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, with strong liberation movements in the 80s. And Honduras was the base for the U.S. military operations, the U.S. wars against the poor in the 1980s. And so the repression against opposition and progressive forces in the 80s was quite intense in Honduras. And it has emerged, the social movements, with new strength and vigor in the last decade. So as those movements grew, there was a moment, an opportunity, un espacio. A space was created with President Zelaya this last 2 years, which was quite remarkable. Because Zelaya, the president, elected president of Honduras, is from one of the two traditional political parties established to protect the interests of the bourgeoisie, the oligarchy there, and his family. He's a very large landowner. His parents were involved. His father was involved in one of the most notorious massacres of peasants in Honduras. But 2 years ago, he began to see that for Honduras to develop, it really needed to include more than just the oligarchy. Supporting just the interests of the oligarchy was not going to develop Honduras, and he created some space and began to see that there were some policies that could be effected that would improve the lives of the majority of Hondurans, who are dramatically poor. I mean, we're talking about more than half of the people of Honduras that live in poverty, less than $2 a day, and a third that live in extreme poverty, less than $1 a day. And so he began to do things like raise the minimum wage. He did things like make possible a speedy transfer of title to peasants who occupied unused land. he began to do some very basic things to help the poorest of the poor. And he also opened the door for the social movements to participate in a democratic process, to really participate for the first time in developing a future for Honduras.
Let me ask you why you think Zayela had this sort of personal transformation. Was it he felt he was being surrounded by more progressive governments? Was he a man who, of some conscience, that just rebelled against his background?
We asked this question of a lot of different folks while we were in El Salvador, and there were a number of different takes on this, and I don't know that anyone has a complete picture as to what happened there. Talking with a young college university student who was involved in a wonderful group, Los Necios, an amazing group of youth who actually was friends with the president's daughter, and was the first person to receive a call from the daughter when the president's house was under attack and being fired upon by the troops before he was taken out in his pajamas and removed from power by the military coup. And this young man said, in the house of Zelaya, even though it's a very conservative family, the culture of artists, of popular movements are a part of the culture in the family. So listening to songs of the new song movements, or reading poets of the progressive movements were a part of Zelaya's family. So even so that there was at least the possibility of some of these ideas being in the family. And then you have a situation in which in order the economic crisis, the collapse of Wall Street, and Zelaya looking for concrete ways to bring resources into Honduras to enable the development, and ALBA and the resources from Latin America, as Latin America has begun to develop its own institutions, alternatives to the IMF and World Bank, that Zelaya actually had the support of a significant number of the oligarchy to look at that as a way to bring resources into Honduras. And he began to say, what can I do to lower the price of gasoline? Because the price of gasoline, petróleo, in Honduras is really hurting our economy. And he negotiated with, to a large degree, the support of many sectors in the elite, renegotiated the purchase of gasoline through Petrocaribe, which is Venezuelan oil, and it cut in half the price of gasoline. So some was just his need to find resources in an economic crisis, and some opening to a progressive thought. And so who knows what the combinations were. But he brought for the first time in the history of Honduras, social movements to the table. They had access to the presidential palace. Zelaya, for the year before he was overthrown, actually had meetings with the leadership of the popular movements and his ministers. And they'd sit down and say, what can we do to address the problems of poverty in the campo? What can we do to address issues of indigenous rights? And the leaders of these social movements, for the first time, had a place at the table. And it was just, people were amazed. And talking with members of the trade union movement, the indigenous movement, women's movement, Garifuna, all of these movements, they were very skeptical at first. You know, who is this guy who's really comes from the elite? Can we trust him? But they said, well, we have to take advantage of this opening. And they took advantage of it. Things began to develop. And Zelaya made a decision to open the conversation for a new constitutional assembly that said...
Now, that was the reason that apparently that's what they gave for jumping all over.
Yes, and that was, and the lie that was perpetrated to the United States and in the international media was that the change in constitution was so that Zelaya could extend his term of office. That's an outright lie. The embassy, when we met with the embassy, everybody knows that was a lie, but it was the clear involvement of a development of a PR campaign to perpetrate misinformation and lies immediately when the coup was carried out. They had this propaganda plan in action. Zelaya never put forward that the constitutional change would allow him to remain in office. And everybody knew that. His term was over, going to be over in the beginning of 2010. He was never going to be able to be a candidate, and everyone knew this. The issue was a new social contract. Would it be possible for the first time to continue this process in which women, indigenous, youth, campesinos, workers were at the table to say, what social contract will help develop all of Honduras and not simply protect the property of the wealthy and the military?